to Mindcrime Liberty Show with me, Swin Dobson, and him, Tim Patton. Today we're joined by Matteo Salonia of the University of Nottingham to discuss what was Christendom and how did it end. Matteo is a lecturer in history at the University of Nottingham in Ningbo, and is an expert in early Renaissance history. Is that fair, Matteo? Early Renaissance?
Yeah, I would say late Middle Ages, early modern period. Yes.
Thank you for joining us, Matteo.
Hello, Sweden. Hello, team. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be on your podcast.
Thank you for joining us, Matteo. Now to the topic at hand. So, Matteo, what was Christendom? And what were the ideas that underlie this sort of civilizational period in European history?
I think that to define Christendom, we have to, first of all, take a step back from most of our assumptions about the modern state and about the secular world in which we live, the secularized world in which we live today. Latin Christendom in particular will be the part of Christendom that we'll be discussing. And Latin Christendom was really, I would say, an array of self-governing kingdoms, nations, cities, and different kinds of associations and communities. So, in other words, these didn't have a centralized or territorialized monopolist of legislation, jurisdiction, or violence as we have today in the modern state. Rather, these different communities were united by the same Christian faith. Over time, this idea was, we could say, embodied in the development of two parallel hierarchies, empire and church, or anyway, the secular sphere and the ecclesiastical sphere. And this distinction of political and religious spheres was unique to Christian civilization, and it forms, I would say, the context for the spread of ideas such as rights claims and individual freedom. In other words, this duality between the political sphere on the one hand and the religious sphere on the other hand, this distinction between church and state, which is so characteristic of Christianity, this duality created a constant tension, a constant need for cooperation between these two spheres, which in turn had to check the power of the other and had to articulate in sophisticated ways their claims to autonomy and action in society. And as a result of this, rights claims and rights discourses were imbued in pretty much all contexts of these Christian societies. So communities and polities in medieval Latin Christendom, we could say, were kind of obsessed by their privileges, charters, and rights, precisely because of this context of constant discussion and clashes between hierarchies. I will also stress that there were competing jurisdictions and overlapping hierarchies also within each of these two spheres, within the secular hierarchy and within the ecclesiastical one. So just to give you a practical example, when in medieval Europe, universities are invented and start to appear throughout the map of Christendom, well, universities have their own jurisdiction, which one may say is at times secular, under the secular umbrella or under the ecclesiastical umbrella if they are under the protection of the Pope or of the local bishop. But the issue is that nevertheless, the universities are self-governing bodies. So you have a free association of people who gather together, who give rules to each other, and who rule themselves, and who even have the right to adjudicate legal arguments, legal disputes between their members, and also to judge their members in cases regarding crimes or other disputes. So as a result of all this, what you have is a sort of double definition of Christendom, but the two levels of this definition are absolutely intertwined. On the one level, Christendom is a society oriented towards God, a society structured around the liturgical life of the church and shaken to the core regularly by reform movements that seek to reorient it towards the transcendent, to reorient it towards God. So reform movements like the Benedictine monastic movement, or the Cluniac reform, or the Franciscan order, or the actions and words of Saint Catherine of Siena. But on the other hand, at the other level, you also have this characteristic of plural jurisdictions, partly overlapping and partly in competition with each other. And I hope that later I will give you some more examples. But I hope that this, as a working definition, sounds already interesting to you and to your audience.
No, that's very, very, very helpful, Matteo. So, just as a general guide, which time period are we talking about from the sort of the beginning, the definite sort of, the beginning and end, however you want to define the beginning and end? What broad time periods are we looking at?
This is one of those questions that the more I read, the more I study, the more I look at the sources, and the more I continue to change my mind about this. But I would say that definitely one of the key turning points that are often indicated in the literature is the conversion of Constantine, the Roman emperor, who ended the persecutions and with the Edict of Milan allowed Christian worship throughout the empire, throughout the empire. That's debatable, because then he controls only part of the empire and then gets to control the rest of it, claiming in part that Christians were still being persecuted or mistreated. But anyway, that is one of the turning points of the possible beginnings of Christendom. Although later, perhaps I will give you a counter argument about this. And the end of Christendom, I will say, is a long business, which begins partly already in the 15th century, when some of the so-called new monarchies, some of the Catholic countries and kingdoms in particular, erode the prerogatives and the powers of self-governance of the church. And then the definitive blow, I would say, is with Machiavellianism and with Protestantism.
So Machiavelli, early 16th century, if I remember correctly.
Yes, early 16th century, and with Luther as well in the early 16th century. Obviously, they kind of correspond to the two levels of my definition, right? Because with Machiavelli, you have an assault on the idea of decentralization and plural jurisdictions and private governance. And with Luther, you have the attack on the Catholic Church. But in reality, if later we have time, we can see how actually the issues are always, these two issues are always intertwined. So it's true that Machiavelli mostly attacks the weakness, as he sees, of the states at his time, and he wants a stronger and more centralized state. But at the same time, his vision is also very secularist. And with regard to Luther, one may say the same. It is true that he attacks the church, but in attacking the church, he ushers in a new conception of the state that is more centralized and that is a monopolist of violence.
So, back to the start, so the Christendom and its sort of the way it was constituted. How does it emerge? What kind of ideas are behind Christendom? Because as you've stridently pointed out, it's somewhat different to the concepts of the modern state we have today. So, what kind of ideas were at the heart of shaping Europe in that time? So it was in this sort of this dual role of the church and the state, and with overlapping jurisdictions, etc.
Okay, well, with regard to the constitution of this new corporate body, we may say, which is the church, a transnational organization claiming a space of autonomy and freedom for itself vis-a-vis the imperial government, we could say that Christianity has this idea of limiting the power of the state as an intrinsic idea, as an idea that is at the core of Christianity. And indeed, the persecutions during the empire were mostly due to the fact that Christians made certain qualifications to their loyalty to the state. They were loyal to the state, but not to the point of throwing a pinch of incense, as you know. And now this is just a symbolic story, the story about the incense. It's not as if the Roman elite really believed that or anyway, most people among the Roman elite really believed that the emperor was a god, or that signified that in any particular way that had been spelled out theologically. It's more that the pagan Romans were annoyed at the fact that the Christians took everything so seriously, right? They took everything so seriously in the sense that they thought that by throwing that incense, they were really admitting the divinity of the emperor, right? Whereas the Romans had more the attitude of saying, well, look, this is just to keep the masses under control. Why should you bother the masses by questioning the divinity of the emperor? But of course, that's the whole point for the Christians. The Christians wanted precisely to bother the masses and to go to the slaves or to the shoemakers or to the bakers, the workers, and tell them, look, this is the truth. There is only one God, and he's a God of love, and he's Christ. Now, however, I have to say that rather than looking at Christianity itself, in this case, as the rise of Christianity itself, as the beginning of Christendom, it is better to look at the aftermath of the Council of Nicaea. And the reason is that in the aftermath of the Council of Nicaea, you really have, for the first time, Christians articulating in a more sophisticated way, what is their position with regard to the relationship between the church and the state. So after the Edict of Milan in 313, persecutions against Christians end. But the problem is that, according to Constantine, Constantine still has the Roman vision of the state. And so he still he believes that the state has a duty, the emperor has a duty to manage the peaceful life of the church, because of course the Roman emperor was, among other things, Pontifex Maximus, so the head of the religious life of the empire. And so when the first heresies, where the first clashes among Christians take place, Constantine is deeply troubled by this. He is sincerely troubled, because he believes, remember, that he had been made emperor thanks to the Christian deity, thanks to the Christian God. And so he really thinks that this is something not only unpleasant, but dangerous for his rule and for the peace of the empire. And so he starts intervening, and I won't give you the details, but he starts to call councils of bishops to solve some of the first diatribes among Christians. The first argument is the one with the Donatists in North Africa, who believed that the bishops who had given up the holy books during the persecutions, rather than being tortured or killed, their sacraments were not valid anymore. The second clash, which is much more important, is the one between the Arians and what later on, remain as the Orthodox Christians. In the case of the Arian heresy, which was about Christology, so the nature of the second person of the Trinity, Constantine calls the Council of Nicaea in 325, even though he is not a churchman, and he oversees the works of the council, even though he is not even been baptized at that point, because he's only baptized at the end of his life. And so at this point, you realize for the first time that the emperor can be too friendly with the church. There is something as being too friendly, right? So in the aftermath of this council, where Arianism is declared a heresy, you have several bishops kind of like thinking back on what has happened. And for example, you have Bishop Hosius of Cordova, who writes to Constantine's son in 355. And he tells him, and I'm reading what he says, "Do not interfere in matters ecclesiastical, nor give us orders on such questions, but learn about them from us. For into your hands God has put the kingdom, but the affairs of the church he has committed to us. If any man stole the empire from you, he will be resisting the ordinance of God. In the same way, you on your part should be afraid lest in taking upon yourself the government of the church, you incur the guilt of a great offense." End of quote. So you see that this is remarkable. This is remarkable because this is the origin, in a sense, of the doctrine of the two swords. The church claims independence, institutional autonomy from the empire, and it creates a space for freedom vis-a-vis the state. On the other side of Eurasia, we have the Chinese Empire dictating to the Buddhist monks who can become a Buddhist monk, how he should be educated, what kind of exam they have to take, what kind of dress they have to wear, where they can go, where they cannot go, and limiting their property rights and so on. So this is pretty remarkable, I think. I know that we have come to take the distinction between church and state for granted, but this is quite remarkable, and it's definitely one of the turning points.
You mentioned to me for history of Christendom was Charlemagne, despite his sort of barbarian, or because of his barbarian origins. How does Charlemagne play into the creation of Christendom in a slightly later period?
Yes. Well, before to get into Charlemagne, let me just mention quickly a couple of other turning points, because one may say, right, so this emergence of claims by the church of being autonomous vis-a-vis the state can only explain partly what happens in terms of the formation of the of Christendom as I've defined it previously, right? I mean, where are the plural jurisdictions? Where is the plurality of law and the plurality of corporations, or anyway of assemblies or nations, of kingdoms? Well, for that, the second turning point will be the so-called Barbarian Invasions, which obviously are related to Charlemagne later on, because Charlemagne is a Frank. But the so-called Barbarian Invasions are actually a much longer process of barbarization of the empire and so on. But what matters for our conversation is simply this, that the Germanic peoples have a different idea of law from the one held by the Romans. The Romans truly believe that reasonable men of every nation can agree upon a common law. Of course, they will still be free to hold their own customary laws for petty matters and for more local issues. But the jurisdiction for what matters, for things like criminal law and so on, should be united under the empire. So Roman law is the law of a territorialized and sovereign empire. When the Germanic peoples come around, they bring to what will become Europe a very different set of notions. The Germanic people see law as a heritage of their ethnic group, and so they reject the idea of an imperial law or of a law that unites different peoples. They have the law of their ancestors, depending on their group. And so the Goths will have their own law, and the Burgundians will have their own law, and the Franks will have their own law, and so on. And after the collapse of the Roman order, what happens is that the Roman law just becomes one more option among the others for the remnants of the Roman population that is now being ruled by different barbarian kings. I think that this is really important because it really shows another turning point. And if Christian monotheism and the autonomy of the religious sphere is one of the turning points. The other turning point is surely the plurality of laws that you start to have with the so-called barbarian kingdoms. And obviously, again, the two things are intertwined because Christianity is influencing the barbarians, although most of them initially convert to Arianism. For example, the custom of writing down the law is due to the influence of Christianity. The softening of brutality in some of the Germanic traditions, the elevation of the of woman in society, or the elevation of kingship to a universal role of judge. That is understandable between different groups of barbarians. All of these are things that come from the impact of Christianity. So Christianity bridges the plurality of jurisdictions by offering a kind of like common shared morality, and with time, a shared liturgical life, and with time, a shared notion of the transcendent, which in and of itself, I mean, having a shared notion of the transcendent, may have some of your listeners who are not Christians roll their eyes, but I mean, having a common shared view of the transcendent is pivotal to reject or to laugh off, as they deserve to be laughed off, any sort of project of social engineering. So to give an example, there is the Code of King Alfred the Great in the 9th century, which begins with the 10 Commandments. But at the same time, you have other codes like the Burgundian Code, which was written much earlier, which is a statutory law, but it's simply recording the customary law of the Burgundian people. So again, this plurality of law gives rise to a plurality of jurisdiction. I hope that you see why, because obviously under the same king, there will be some Romans, there will be some Franks, there will be some Burgundians, and each of them need to be or claims that he has a right to be judged according to his own law. And the third and final turning point that I will mention is the Islamic conquest, because the Islamic conquests redraw the map of Christendom. The heart of Christendom had been up until that point in the Middle East and North Africa. Because of the Islamic conquest, the map gets redrawn. I mean, it's the beginning of an assault on Christendom that will last for 1,000 years. But there are some consequences that also have to do. There are some indirect consequences that have to do with the centers of Christianity, right? So up to the moment of this Islamic conquest, the three most prestigious seats in Christendom in terms of bishoprics had been Rome, Antioch, and Alexandria. Antioch and Alexandria are under the authority, the strict authority of the emperor in the east, in Constantinople. Whereas the Pope in Rome has this claim to primacy, but he's surrounded by barbarians, he's constantly under siege, he's isolated. But after the Islamic conquest, because of the Islamic conquest, the primacy of Rome and the heart, I mean, in other words, the primacy of Rome is enhanced, and the heart of Christendom moves to the western half of Christendom, to the Latin half of Christendom, where Caesaropapism is impossible because the emperor is so far away. And in other words, the church is paradoxically more in danger because of the rough barbarians surrounding it, but it's also more free from imperial control. It's more free on theological and ecclesiastical issues to take its own position and to self-govern. I hope that this makes sense. So these are more or less the three turning points that I will. I mean, obviously there are other turning points that one may claim, but definitely these are three important moments or factors in the formation of the ideas of Christendom. And I don't know if you want to comment on this, or if you want me to move on to Charlemagne.
I was just going to mention. It was interesting you noted that the Christians started writing the law down. It is interesting how the Middle Ages tends to be, well, it's the Middle Ages for one thing. It is in between sort of the classical period and the Renaissance. You know, it's just in between bit that we should kind of ignore because nothing really of great use happened. And it was also sort of associated with the Dark Ages as well, although that tends to be, I don't know, at least in England goes, and probably not last, like sort of not the late Middle Ages typically. But I do think that it is of interest that you note that the Christianity had the influence of sort of writing law down. You could go to Charlemagne earlier if you wish, but I was just thinking it would be interesting to for you to mention, how Christianity and how sort of influential and how much sort of innovation, as it were, was taking place sort of in the realm of law and constitution, law and government that took place in the period of Christendom. Just to go back to the sort of Middle Ages point, in order to say philosophy, we don't need to go to philosophy particularly, but it's always interesting that if you get history of philosophy courses, you tend to end up, you'll finish in the Greek period, or you may go to some of the Roman, maybe some of the Roman thinkers, Marcus Aurelius possibly.
Yes.
Just ignore everybody until.
Yes, I think that this is, I mean, this is obviously a very interesting question, which partly brings us back to Charlemagne, right? I mean, we are in a context of profound demographic and economic crisis, and yet at this time, the Church and Christian civilization carry over the treasures of antiquity. I mean, you mentioned the Renaissance earlier. Where do the Renaissance the Renaissance writers and the humanists go to find their sources, to find their ancient treatises and to rediscover ancient philosophy? Well, they mostly go to Catholic monasteries, because that's where, for centuries and painstakingly, Benedictine monks had been copying these manuscripts, saving them from destruction. So the Middle Ages are a pivotal moment, even simply materially speaking, because of that. But they are a pivotal moment for so many other reasons. I mean, they lay the foundations for the economic rise of Europe. With agrarian developments, with the commercial revival, which is really a commercial revolution that brings the level of economic productivity beyond, not just to a recovery of what it was during the Roman Republic, but way beyond it, with the invention of new institutions, banks, bills of exchange, and many others. So, I mean, obviously, the issue of how to defend the medieval period and why the medieval period has been attacked so viciously is a very broad one. Here I just gave you a few ideas. But going back to Charlemagne, and going back to one of the things that you asked about, what was changing in terms of like constitutional issues. Well, one of the constitutional issues is definitely the figure of the king. And the king during the Middle Ages becomes, partly because of the impact of Christianity, a figure with some very precise duties, mostly the defense of his people and the let's say carrying out the role of a judge. That's what the king has to do primarily in this period. But this emerges over time, because initially, if we look at the kingdom of the Franks, their first dynasty, the Merovingian family, had a very different vision. The Merovingians are barbarians who see themselves as a family of kings. So in other words, the Merovingians are born as kings. There is nothing particular that they have to do to show that they are good kings. They are born kings. They are not interested in the fate of the people whom they happen to rule. They are simply military leaders for their Frankish nobles who happen to have come in possession of certain lands where also Burgundians and Romans and Gallo-Romans were living. So, in other words, the Merovingians don't have a sophisticated view of kingship and of their role in terms of leaders of a country, of a kingdom. This comes in time later on, and in particular with the change of dynasties from Merovingian to Carolingian. And this brings us back to the issue of the relationship between church and state. The Carolingians are an increasingly powerful Frankish family who ends up having de facto the control of the kingdom, so that this family is actually more powerful than the Merovingians who are formally ruling the country. And what happens in 751 is that Pepin, one of these Carolingians, asks the Pope in Rome whether it is opportune for the one who truly holds power to also be king. This is a very charged question. Now, so it happens that at that time in Rome, the Pope was under the assault of the Lombards, an Arian group of Germanic peoples. And on the other hand, the Franks had converted directly from paganism to Catholicism. And so the Pope is thinking, you know what? Yes, if you are effectively in charge of your people, you should also be the king. And by the way, I need some help down here, so it would be nice if you help me to fight the Lombards. And that's exactly what Pepin does. But what this creates is an alliance between church and state, which implies that the new line of kings will have to constantly prove its legitimacy. They are not born kings like the Merovingians. They have been made kings by being anointed by the church, the bishop, and then the Pope. And also, because they have to constantly prove their legitimacy, they also have to accept limits to their power, to their authority. So in this situation, kingship becomes based on consultation with the nobles. So the king starts to have a council of nobles around himself. And you can see that his rule is not arbitrary. It is checked by the church and it is checked by the nobles. The crowning of a new king, well, the elevation of a new king is very interesting because he first is declared king by the nobles upon an oath that he takes. Then he is anointed by the bishop or the pope. And finally, he is lifted up on the throne by his nobles. So you see that the symbolism here is really interesting because immediately you see how the king cannot be a despot. He is made king. And when it comes to Charlemagne in particular, what's interesting is that he takes a special interest in the fate of his people, or rather of his peoples, because he is very successful at war. And so he has under his control eventually a lot of different groups of people, not just the Franks and the Burgundians and the Gallo-Romans, but also parts of the Italians and the Lombards and the Saxons and many others. And what he has in mind is the revival of the empire in the West. But this revival in Charlemagne's mind has to be a Christian revival, of course. So he favors the church, and you have this very strict cooperation between church and state. And once again, just like it happened with Constantine, a friend can become too close. And so you see here why the duality that I described before is so important. Because when Charlemagne even dares to write a letter to the Pope in which he tells him openly that the task of Charlemagne, of the empire, is to defend the church, but also to fortify it by making sure that the teachings of the church are passed down. And the role of the Pope is simply to lift up his arms and pray. And this basically means that the church will be turned into a department of the state, right? This will roll back the distinction between church and state brought by Christianity. Well, the reaction of the Pope is to interpret the act of the coronation of Charlemagne in 800 in Rome, the very famous coronation of Charlemagne, in a way that pushes back, so that the people writing at the Curia, at the court of the Pope, interpret his gesture as having made Charlemagne emperor. Constitutus is the word in the Latin text, whereas the people at the court of Charlemagne try to downplay what happened at the coronation, and this means that they have two different conceptions of the relationship between church and state. But what matters for us is that the church is there to check the power of the state, the imperial state of Charlemagne in this case, and to claim again its autonomy, its space of freedom and independent action.
Your point on independent action is interesting. I got to know the medieval political system mostly indirectly, well, reading some of Hans Hopper's work, in particular the Democracy, the God That Failed, and he sort of highlights the period as a sort of well, it's not exactly a natural order, and I don't actually think he would argue that it's monarchy as he advocates for, well, at least in contrast to democracy, because that's normal. That's probably better ascribed to sort of the absolute monarchs of, say, the 18th century, 19th, more so than the medieval period. But Hopper argues it's very much of a decentralized Europe, and more in keeping with what a sort of broadly libertarian anarcho-capitalist society would look like. So I'm interested in how these realms of independence were carved out. How does this relate to sort of like an overall sort of like legal systems? You mentioned overlapping jurisdictions. How does that work without creating sort of a legal uncertainty as to which law prevails in a particular area? And also how dissimilar or similar would you expect let's put it this way. Suppose you had a Europe of Monacos, Andorras, etc. How similar or dissimilar would you think the medieval period would be relative to a more modern situation, if that's a question that's possible to be answered briefly or at all? So those are a few ideas. I've asked a lot. Tackle it how you see best.
So in terms of how will conflicts will be resolved over a territory that has competing or overlapping jurisdictions? That was one of your questions. Am I correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Well, this is I think, I really believe that if we could go back in time and pose this question to a medieval jurist or to a medieval lawyer, they will be very baffled by this question, because this is a very modern question, and we have been trained into thinking about sovereignty as something monolithic by the state. We are constantly bombarded by state propaganda that claims that we could never live without the modern state, right? But medieval states functioned in a very different way. The law was not always territorialized. And so some of the law was applied to persons, not to places. So because you were a cleric, you fell in most cases under the authority and the jurisdiction of the church. It didn't really matter where you found yourself to travel. Or if you are a merchant and you are visiting a foreign port, well, that port may be in Tunis, just for the sake of an example. But if you have a dispute with a fellow merchant, it doesn't matter whether you are Genoese and he's Venetian and you found yourself in Tunis. What matters is that you fall under the jurisdiction of merchant law. Now, there have been historians recently who have tried to claim that merchant law is an invention and that merchant law is not really a big deal because it was different depending on the place and it wasn't always applied in the same way. And yes, that's the whole point. That's the whole point, that it wasn't the same in every single place. But anyway, you will resort to private arbitration, and you will call upon the services of a trusted, an experienced merchant, or anyways, a notary who had, or somebody who had experience in issues related to merchandise. Or let's say if you were a student, I already gave this example earlier. If you are a student of a university, it doesn't really matter if you have gone to Paris to study and but you come from Florence. Well, the point is that now you are in Paris, and what's your business? Okay, you are there to study. You fall under the jurisdiction of the university, which is this free association of students at the beginning. At the beginning, the universities are associations of students. So in many ways, in many instances, the question that you asked will be simply solved by remembering that law is personal and not territorialized in pre-modern times. Now, in terms of the rest of your question, I think it could be useful to mention some examples of how sophisticated medieval law was, how inventive, how beautiful the solutions found were, and how many experiments were run by medieval people, depending on the circumstances in which they were. For example, in Genoa, Genoa was established as a voluntary comune in 1096. And the nobles who established this commune swore an oath and decided to have consuls whom they will elect to govern the city. And everything went well up until around 1164. And from 1164, we have the period of civil wars that last until 1194. Now, the point is, why do I mention this? I mention this because in 1194, civil wars are ended. How? With an institutional experiment that works. Not with the creation of a modern state, but with a very different and for us maybe unthinkable kind of solution, because you had different clans, because you have different noble families fighting each other in the streets of the city and competing for the consulship. Well, the solution seems to the Genoese to be the following: why don't we call a foreign professional in law, who, being foreigner, is super partes, so he is impartial? We call him in to be the judge in Genoa, but obviously the problem is, okay, what if this guy becomes colluded? What if this guy allies himself with one of the factions? Or what if this guy becomes too powerful and himself a dictator? Of course, the Genoese, medieval people were not stupid. They will ask the same questions that we ask. And this is why the figure of the podesta was regulated through a contract that he had to sign. He could be the podesta in the city only for 1 year. He could not buy property. He could not marry or have any family member marrying any Genoese citizen. He could not bring with himself more armed men than the ones established in the contract. And he, at the end of his tenure, he had to stay within the walls of the city for 15 days to respond of any accusations of wrongdoings. Now, this is a solution that is quite inventive and quite different from what we would think of in the modern time. But the podestaria, this institution of the podesta, worked. It worked very well. And for the following century and more, Genoa was pacified and became one of the most powerful city-states in Christendom. Another example that I can give you is the example of composite monarchies. Many people in your audience, I'm sure, have been following what's going on in Catalonia recently. Now, why do the people in Catalonia have this very strong sense of national identity and autonomy? Why do they have this very characteristic culture? Why do they have their own language, their own literature? Well, partly this has to do with the medieval history of Spain, quote unquote Spain. Actually, Spain is a product of modernity. Spain itself, as the result of the reconquest by the Christian kingdoms coming down from the north and reconquering the Iberian Peninsula from the Islamic rule, Spain was a collection of crowns. And in particular, there isn't really anything remotely similar to Spain before 1469, when the Queen of Castile, Isabella, and the King of Aragon, Ferdinand, marry. But what is interesting is that Aragon is itself a composite monarchy. The crown of Aragon is actually the union of three kingdoms: Aragon proper, Valencia, and Catalonia. And each of these kingdoms maintain their statutes, their customary law, their autonomy, and their privileges. Privileges means, for example, that the king cannot ask for money to Catalonia in the same way in which he asks for money to Aragon. And in all of these cases, if he wants to ask for something, he has to call on the local parliaments and obtain not simple majorities, but super majorities or even unanimity if he wants to raise funds, if he wants to raise an army. And so you see, the medieval conception of liberty is so imbued, is so intertwined with this idea of plurality of jurisdictions, and that is at once difficult for us to grasp, but also very much fascinating. The nobles in Catalonia, when swearing their fealty to a new king, will say a sentence to the effect of, "We who are not any worse than you swear fealty to you who are not any better than us, and only as long as you shall keep the law, keep and respect the laws and privileges of our country." And so you see that the limits to the centralization of power in medieval Christendom came from many different quarters: from the church as a transnational institution. Within the church, there were different religious orders and so on, from a personal conception of the law, from freedom of association, which immediately created new jurisdictions, and from competing powers even within the same crown. And I hope that these examples are interesting to you, I mean, for people who may think, okay, what did this give to modernity? I mean, why should we care about this right now? It is from constitutional principles developed in medieval Christendom that we derive some of the so-called modern human rights or modern constitutional concepts. For example, the principle of quod omnes tangit ab omnibus approbatur, which means that basically what touches all is to be approved by all. Well, this was not invented by John Locke. This was articulated in the context of the development of canon law, the law regulating the life of the church. And canon lawyers debated for centuries what should happen in the case of a heretical pope, what should happen in the case of a pope who is a sinner, a public sinner. The pope should not, even the pope, notwithstanding his supremacy, has a limit to his authority. But how can we define this limit? How should the limit be enforced? And so on. And all of these discussions were later on influencing the development of constitutional law in the secular realm, because obviously the duality that I described before meant also that church and states, or church and secular jurisdictions, were not just competing with each other and checking on each other, but also in a constant dialogue. They were influencing each other.
That's some very detailed and interesting examples. What I'm thinking is now, though, is if the situation worked as well as you said it did, which I have no reason to deny, what then precipitates the move away from these non-territorial monopolists? Well, not monopolists really, non-territorial law overlapping jurisdictions. What then precipitates the move towards a more centralized concept, territorialized concept of sovereignty? And how and what time periods are we talking about as to when the modern state begins its ascent?
Well, as Ludwig von Mises said, the genuine history of mankind is the history of ideas. And contrary to some accounts that are technologically deterministic, or accounts that stress economic structures and so on, I think that ideas really have an impact on socio-political changes. And with time, we see the development of ideas that question these jurisdictions, this jurisdictional competition, or this jurisdictional variety, and or this plurality of well, let's say of judges, of arbitrators, and of lawgivers. There are many different opinions about the turning points. Surely there have been people like Marsilius of Padua, for example, who have argued for a stronger central government already during the late Middle Ages. But I would say that two revolutionary and disastrous steps are the ones taken by Machiavelli and Luther. Now, with Machiavelli, we see the denial of the natural law. We see the well, if not the creation of a concept of reason of state, because this was already had already been developed earlier, but definitely a bold and unapologetic defense of the concept of reason of state. That's the issue with Machiavelli. It's not that he's the first to propose this, but he is the first to do it so boldly and unapologetically. Reason of state and the denial of natural law practically means that from now on, there is a morality for the state, a moral code for the state, and a different moral code for everybody else. So the state, gets a pass for what it does. The monarchs can get a pass for what they do, because, well, if you have read Machiavelli, you know his reasoning. And the idea is that the interest of the state, whether a principality or not, comes first. The state should also not tolerate internal competition to its jurisdictional authority. The state should be militarized. Let's remember that Machiavelli himself directly oversaw one of the first experiments in conscription in Florence. Machiavelli also mocks Jesus Christ as a model of political leader. He indirectly does so, whereas he sees as good political leaders those who were armed, those who were ready to strike first and to use violence against their enemies. I mean, it's a complete reversal of the conception of political philosophy, morality, and constitutionalism that you have in the medieval period. The other disastrous step is the one taken by Luther. And if you have I mean, obviously, having heard what I said at the beginning about the importance of the Catholic Church for the development of ideas such as the distinction of church and state, and for the development of a context within which arguments about competing spheres of jurisdictions could in turn favor the development of a plurality of jurisdictions and a tradition of rights claims. Well, you probably already understand why I think that Luther was really instrumental to the downfall of Christendom. It's important to realize that the origins of the secular dominance over the church started before the so-called wars of religion. The wars of religions, the wars of religion were not really wars of religion. They were wars with which the state took over powers or jurisdictions that were ecclesiastical, that had been ecclesiastical. And Luther contributes to this by claiming that there is a coercive power that is ordained by God not to be given to ecclesiastical authorities, but only to secular authorities. So in other words, Luther denies any ecclesiastical jurisdiction. He does so in many of his writings, also in To the Christian Nobility of the German Nation. And so this theory that Luther develops is the denial and the defeat of the medieval theory of the two swords, and it relegates Christianity and the church as a corporate body to the private sphere. But by relegating Christianity to the private sphere, this means that now the bodies of the bodies of Christians are handed over to the state. And to some extent, not just the bodies, but also their minds. Because with the principle that later develops, cuius regio eius regius. So the idea is that whatever is the faith of the king will have to be the faith of the country ruled by the king, at least officially. So with Luther, we also see another development that ushers in modernity, which is the idea of the universal priesthood. Now, the idea of the universal priesthood is the origin of the most extreme forms of egalitarianism. Remember that politics is downstream of culture, all right, but it is also downstream of theology. True atheism is impossible. Everybody has a theology. Everybody has a metaphysics, whether they like it or not. And so with the theological idea of universal priesthood, what you have is the denial of any natural hierarchy, of any ecclesiastical hierarchy, of any apostolic hierarchy, and of any sort of hierarchy such as the ones that characterize the different associations of medieval Christendom. So brought to its consequences, to its extreme consequences, the idea of a universal priesthood ends up with Jacobinism. Obviously, we don't have the time to follow all the developments of this, but I hope that this answers your question. Obviously, other people may have different opinions about the turning point for the end of Christendom, but these, I think, are two important turning points. And there is a great article by William Cavanaugh who explains how the wars of religion were not really about religion, and also the consequences of Luther's ideas in the making of the myth of the state as a peacemaker. In this myth that we have that, we need the state because without the state we wouldn't have peace.
The topic of the day is Christendom, and I think the implicit or explicit premise here is that historical Christendom, or the Latin variety, is more closer to the standard than the post-Luther version. Isn't the premise behind Christianity is Christendom is Christianity? Isn't Christianity a kind of universal creed including of the Catholic or Latin variety, not just merely of the Protestant variety, where wasn't the sort of ammunition already there and Luther just sort of brought it out? Wasn't it? You can get sort of Protestant-like tendencies earlier. I mean, isn't Christianity a kind of universal thing anyway? There's not going to be some law for Antioch or Genoa or even later on America or Mexico. It's going to be roughly the same thing on the important things all around anyway. So isn't the universalism already there and Luther's just bringing it to the forefront?
Okay. I think that definitely Christianity is a universal religion. That's without doubt, and indeed that is one of the strengths of Christianity. It's monotheism and it's universalism. But I'm not sure that you could say that what Luther brought out from Christianity is universalism, in the sense that universalism was already present. The claims of the Catholic Church were pretty close to the claims of the Roman Empire, although on a different level, right? Just like the Roman Empire had this conception of law as something being understandable and universal. Universal because it was understandable by all men. Similarly, the church was the church of all races, and it was a missionary church from the start, right? And especially after Gregory the Great. Gregory the Great really gives impulse to the conversion of the barbarians in Northern Europe. So I'm not really sure what you mean specifically by saying that it was that Luther brought out universalism in the from Christianity, because I think it was already there, yes, but Luther perhaps indirectly or without willing it, opened the way for national churches, right? Which in a sense are the denial of universalism, the denial of the universal claim of the Church of Rome. And so in favoring the rise of national churches, Lutheranism and Protestantism accelerate the process of centralization of power, because the church in places like England becomes a department of the state. Now, on the other hand, and kind of like to moderate a bit, to nuance a bit the argument that I'm making here, it is true that even before Luther, there had been challenges to the independence of the religious sphere, and so already in the 15th century, in places like Spain, the monarchs had wrestled away from the authority of the church important areas of ecclesiastical jurisdiction. It is also true that in 1516, so before the Lutheran reform, in 1516, the King of France obtains from the Pope, forces the Pope to grant the Concordat of Bologna, after which the bishops in France, the abbots in France, are named by the king, not by the Pope. And so, in a sense, what Luther does is accelerating this process. And one of the things that William Kavanagh notices in his article is that Protestantism does not succeed in all of those countries where the monarchs had already obtained some of the privileges of the church, and by privileges I mean rights in this context. So where the monarchs had no need, had no use for Protestantism, they stayed Catholic. Okay, obviously this is a simplification by William Kavanagh, but I think that there is something true there. In places like France and Spain, the church had already been robbed of some of its prerogatives, of some of its jurisdictions before Luther. I hope that this kind of answers your comment.
It does, but it still seems to be there's a lot of continuity. Luther is picked as the person, but as you brought up about Spain, they already wrestled away a certain privileges. They got certain privileges too. I'll actually use this for a modern analog. I just want to push further on this because it's sort of interest of me. We recently had
and I agree. I agree that there is a lot of continuity, and I also agree that in a non-secularized society, obviously, the Protestant forms of Christianity will also contribute to checking the power of the state, or potentially to create an alternative jurisdictions and overlapping jurisdictions. I completely agree with that. Religious faith is, in and of itself, as I mentioned earlier, whether Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox, something that intrinsically has the potential to limit the power of the state, because it opens up wider horizons. It shows the transcendent, and in other words, it questions one of the things that the modern state does, which is the claim to embrace all of human existence, the claim of the possibility to bring heaven on earth. Well, this is the claim made by the modern state, and of course, Protestant Christians, just as much as Catholic Christians, are a contradiction to this, or are a force to check or to go against this claim.
That's fair enough. Swethan, do you want to continue with your question?
Very briefly, you mentioned Machiavelli and Luther, and I would say that ideas matter. And my interest here is, how do the ideas of Luther and Machiavelli become so widespread and accepted, such that we can have sort of like the origin of the individual that doesn't really exist in the same way before, say, the early modern period? How does all these different sort of theological sort of political ideas disseminate into the population, such that you can have the rise of this modern state? Was it just a case that it was convenient for local kings to take on the mantle of Lutheranism? You could argue to some extent this was what Henry VIII did, although Henry VIII, interestingly, was centralized even earlier than that. Well, Henry VII does. In England, it is very much the start of the modern centralization of the English state, which predates Luther. So was it a case of the kings were trying to, for whatever reason, had got more power, and then this gave them some justification for doing so, and therefore got clerics who were favorable towards them to then disseminate this information to the population? Was it via the printing press and sort of like the upper middle classes who were literate, and it was disseminated that way? Was it multifaceted? This obviously is a very difficult question to answer, but in general, what would your speculations be?
This is indeed a very difficult question. It could be approached from many different angles. Now you were mentioning Henry VIII. Yes, I agree that centralization had started before Henry VIII. In fact, I wrote an article last year for Mises on the Cornish rebellion against Henry VII. But going back to Henry VIII, now you mentioned Henry VIII. One of the things that Henry VIII is famous for is the suppression of the monasteries. Now, the monasteries, the monastic life, is one of the most humble, silent, and yet self-evident signs of contradiction in the world. It introduces a pace of life that is oriented towards the beatific vision. And nowadays, to find a monastery, we have to look for it and travel there, and it may be quite far from wherever we're living. But in medieval England, in medieval Europe, there were thousands of monastic houses. and destroying these very physical, symbolic, but real presence across England. Well, that in and of itself secularizes society. That in and of itself is in a way secularizing religion. And so now you were mentioning that, and I just thought about it. That there are so many different answers that one may give to this question. How were these new ideas about society and the state that were a bit of a denial of Christendom? How were they spread? Well, the sudden disappearance of the monastic life surely contributed to that. Another way in which some of the Lutheran ideas were spread were just through the ban on previous religious practices. There is Eamon Duffy's famous book on the stripping of the altars on this. Now, on things that have more to do with the jurisdictions and with the political organization of Christendom, some of these only were forced upon the rural populations of Europe many centuries later. For example, during the French invasion of Italy, one of the problems that the Napoleonic authorities had was how to force the Italian people to accept conscription. Conscription was something unheard of to the vast majority of the Italian population, who were living in rural areas, had very little contact with any state entity, and what's more, will not be willing to leave their families and their traditional economic patterns of life to go to fight for a foreign king, or even for a newly established puppet state. And so this shows that, and the resistance put up by so many young Italian men, fleeing from their village or pretending to be ill or whatever. This is something that shows that as late as the beginning of the 1800s, there were vast areas of Europe where people had continued to live the life of Christendom, had never come in contact with the modern state, and were eventually brought to accept an entirely different view of the world. I will say mostly through violence. And so you see, if you think about the end of the monastic houses in England in the 16th century, and then these other examples from the 19th century, you have different chronologies, different ways in which these ideas were spread. But obviously, the end result is that we see the end of Christendom as I have defined it previously, or as I've tried to describe it previously, obviously with the limited amount of time that we have.
That's very interesting. That seems to link possibly to sort of maybe urban spheres are easier to control, ideas disseminate more easily, but the rural populations would take it longer.
Remember that the greatest and most effective resistance to the French Revolution within France came from Vendée, which was a rural area of France where the revolutionary government committed genocide against the Catholic population. And interestingly, I mean, the peasants in Vendée represented a bit the spirit of the rest of the peasants in the rest of the country. After the very first stage of the revolution, and after the so-called abolition of feudalism, they were done. They were happy with it. They were fine with the abolition of the dues that they had to pay. According to them, the revolution, okay, that's it. But they didn't want to hear about the abolition of the monarchy. No way. Or the abolition of Christianity, the persecution of the church, the elimination of the church's jurisdiction, or even the creation of a new civic religion with the supreme being and all of that. They were horrified by that, which goes a little bit to show that maybe you have a point there when you talk about the role of urbanization. There were like two different Frances, there were like two different nations really that didn't really know how to talk to each other.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that does play into some modern political disputes between. In America, I think you'll have a big divide between the urban class and the rural bodies, and that'll be one of the major sort of clashes culturally speaking. But thank you for joining us, Matteo. That's been a fascinating survey of Christendom, and I hope we can talk to you again sometime soon.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
I'd just now like to thank everyone for listening. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please share it with your friends and family. And please subscribe to us on YouTube and Podbean. The more subscribers we get, the higher we get in the search rankings, and the more people can access this material. And if you'd like to contact the show for any reason, please contact us at mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com. gmail.com. That's mindcrimelibertyshow@gmail.com.